Hey guys, Jason here. So I've gotten a lot of questions lately on how I record my bass tracks for metal. And most of you asking me these questions are guitar players. And like me, us guitar players like to record our own bass tracks. So in this video, I'm going to give you the full spectrum on how I record my bass tracks with metal using plugins. Alright guys, so I'm going to give you 5 steps to recording bass guitar tracks for metal music using plugins. So step number 1, let's dive right into this. Now step number 1 for recording bass guitar for metal is going to be extremely basic. So some of you are beginners, so this is for your sake. Those of you who have been recording for a while, you're going to know this already. But make sure that you have a decent interface and make sure everything's connected properly. You want to make sure your bass guitar is going into the interface, and of course your interface is going into your computer. And of course I assume you have the recording software. I'm not going to get into all of those details in the recording software. I have another video for that I can refer you to. Step number 2 for recording bass guitar for metal using plugins. Now this is my personal method. I always have a drum track and I have at least one guitar track before I record my bass track. The reason I do that, well, there's 2 reasons. For one, I'd rather record my bass guitar to drums, like a beat, as opposed to a metronome. And the second reason, and this is probably the most important reason, is metal music's really guitar driven. It's based on those guitar riffs that we're writing and playing. So you want the bass to complement those riffs. So it really wouldn't make sense to lay your bass track first. Even if you laid the drums, you still want to have those guitar parts in there before you lay your bass track. Now the caveat to that is when you record the real drums, if you have a real drummer come in and record the tracks, you're gonna want to go back and redo your bass tracks because you want those bass lines to follow what the drummer is doing, and you want all of that stuff, the bass, the guitars, the drums, you want everything to complement one another and you want it to fit. So recording that first track though is important because at least you're getting it down and you have an idea of what you want the bass lines to be. But yes, you will have to go back and re-record the bass again once the real drums are laid. Now step number 3 is where we really start to get into the meat and potatoes, I love meat and potatoes, of recording bass guitar for metal. And this is choosing a plugin. And notice the videos about recording bass guitar tracks for metal using plugins. This is specific to using software for your amp and effects sounds. And in this video, in this demonstration, I'm using a specific plugin. It's called Studio Devil. It's Bass Amp Pro. But you can apply what I'm going to show you in step number 4, which we'll get into the settings. You can apply the settings I will show you to pretty much any plugin. I encourage you to choose a good plugin. This is a great plugin, but I know there's like Amplitude, there's the Positive Grids, Bias Effects, and Bias Amp. I think Bias Amp 2 has like a new series of amp sims coming out, and I hear they're pretty good. And there's many other plugins. Now, if cost is a factor for you, you can use some of the effects that comes in your studio recording software. I use PreSonus Studio One Pro, and so there's compressors, EQs, there's all sorts of effects, so you can practically build your own bass amp from that. So if you're hurting in the funds area, that's one way to do it. And again, we're going to move on to step number 4, which you can apply what I'm going to show you to pretty much whatever you're using. Moving on to step number 4, and this is where we get into the exciting part of our bass tone when we're recording bass guitar for metal using plugins. I'm going to share my personal settings with you, and again, I believe you can apply these concepts, these settings to whatever plugin that you're using. Now, there's 2 crucial parts to this, and one is your bass level, and number 2 is your gain level. If you're moving one up, the other one must come down. Or I should say, if the gain is moved up, your bass setting is going to have to come down. And this is where people make the most mistakes in their bass tone. they think that, okay, it's a bass guitar, I gotta have the bottom end, so they crank the bass on the EQ, you know, up really, really high. All that's gonna do is make your overall sound muddy. And you'll notice that when you dump it down to a file and listen to it in other sources. You can be like, wow, this sounded great in the studio, but it sounds like crap in my headphones. You know, it's like, brr, I can't hear anything. So you have to be real careful with this. And you see my bass is almost all the way down here. I hardly have no bass at all whatsoever on this. You can see my gain is pretty high. Now, I do that because I want a little bit of that distorted sound. Now, you got to be careful with that as well. You don't want too much distortion on your bass guitar, or you won't be able to distinguish the notes that you're playing. Your guitars are going to have plenty of distortion already. It's metal. Your bass can have a little grit, a little edge on it, but you don't want to overdo the distortion on your bass. You kind of want to have that happy medium somewhere. Now, you can also apply an external EQ, which you'll see this plugin has another EQ, and this is kind of like what you would have after your bass amp. If you're recording with a real bass amp, you would have an EQ that's after the amp. And this is kind of how this setup is here. So again, you can see my settings. They might look a little abstract here, a little weird, but you can see my bass, the EQ, it's not up at all. In fact, it's down quite a bit. And you can kind of mimic my settings, you know, use this as a starting point and play around with the settings and, you know, just get what sounds good to you. Now, you can also use effects. I personally don't use effects on my bass tracks because that's another component that makes the bass track muddy. And it might not make the track itself muddy, but when you throw it in with the overall mix of everything else, the whole mix is just muddy. So it's kind of one of those concepts of less is more. Now, if there's a bass solo part, I might add some reverb, chorus, or delay, or whatever, or some specific parts of the song where maybe the guitars are back down a bit, so I want the bass pronounced. I might add some chorus on there just to get, you know, that cool sound. But be careful with that. Alright, and now for our fifth and final step of recording bass guitar for metal using plugins is listening to your full and final mix in multiple sources. That means don't just listen to it in the studio, but listen to it, dump it to an MP3 file, listen to it in your headphones, in your car, listen to it in as many sources as you possibly can. And I'll tell you why in a second, but first, let's play that clip that I played in the beginning because I want you to hear the bass tone in the full mix once again. And this time I want you to specifically listen to the bass notes and the overall bass tone in this mix. So let's check it out. Alright guys, so that wraps it up for our 5 steps of recording bass guitar for metal using plugins. Now, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I will definitely try to answer all the questions. And I'd also like to know what you think about the final mix. Could you hear the bass track? Were the bass notes pronounced in that final mix? Could I have done a better job? Please tell me. Oh, and don't forget, if you haven't already, definitely check out my music and all my albums and releases on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, all those good sources. You can go to this link right here, jasonstallworth.com/music, and that will take you to a page that has all those links where you can access my music. Thank you once again for your support, and keep it metal.